The myth of the Invincible Panzer. By the summer of 1944, after the fall of Normandy, the German army was in retreat across France. Yet one legend still held strong among Panzer crews, that their armored divisions were unmatched. The Panther and Tiger tanks were feared across Europe. Their long 75mm and 88mm guns could knock out a Sherman before the Americans even saw them. German tankers nicknamed the Sherman the Tommy Coacher, Tommy Cooker, because it burned so easily when hit. And indeed, early encounters had proven that reputation. In the open fields of Normandy, a Sherman facing a Panther head-on rarely survived. American crews began to joke bitterly that their tanks were Ronsons. They lit up every time. But what the Germans didn't realize was that the Americans were quietly learning, fast. The calm before Arracourt, September 1944, Lorraine, eastern France. Morning fog hung over the rolling hills near the small town of Arracourt. There, the U.S. 4th Armored Division, under General John S. Wood, had halted to refuel and reorganize. The German front had collapsed in Normandy, and the Americans believed the war might soon be over. But deep in the forest to the east, elements of the 5th Panzer Army, including the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, were preparing a counterattack. Their orders were desperate: punch through the thin American lines, seize Nancy, and split Patton's Third Army. They had over 200 Panthers and Panzer IVs, some of the best armor Germany could still muster. Facing them were fewer than 90 Shermans, many low on fuel, most manned by crews who had never faced a massed German tank assault. The stupid tactic. At dawn on September 19, 1944, the fog was so thick that visibility was less than 100 meters. German tanks advanced blindly through the mist, assuming the Americans were still far away. The U.S. tankers of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion were taken by surprise. German 75mm shells whistled out of the fog, knocking out several Shermans in seconds. But then, something strange happened. Instead of retreating or trying to flank the Panzers, the American tanks charged directly into the fog, toward the gunfire. To the Germans, it looked suicidal. One Panzer commander reportedly laughed over the radio. "They're mad. They drive to their deaths." But the Americans weren't charging blindly. They were using a tactic that seemed idiotic on paper: closing the range to neutralize the German advantage. At long distances, the Panther's high-velocity gun dominated, but up close, the Sherman's faster turret rotation, superior crew coordination, and numbers could overwhelm even the heaviest German tanks. The Americans drove straight into the fog because the Germans couldn't see them either. The ambush turns inside out. Inside his tank, Battalion Basic, Sergeant Glenn G.W. Brugman peered through his periscope. Visibility was almost zero, just gray mist and faint engine noise. "Hold fire till you see the cross," his gunner whispered. Moments later, a dark shape loomed, a Panther's silhouette, gun searching left to right. Fire! The Sherman 75mm shell hit the Panther's flank at less than 80 yards. The German tank erupted in flames, its crew bailing into the fog. The Americans realized they had stumbled into the middle of the German formation. Instead of retreating, they spread out, hunting. Every time a Panther fired, its muzzle flash gave away its position. Within minutes, Shermans were circling like wolves, firing from multiple directions. German crews, unable to see clearly, often fired at shadows, even hitting their own tanks. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing smoking wrecks. In less than an hour, the Germans had lost 12 Panzers, most to Shermans that had used this stupid close-range charge. The German shock. When the surviving Panthers regrouped, their commanders couldn't believe what had happened. How could inferior tanks have outgunned them? Captured radio transcripts later revealed confusion and disbelief among the Germans. The enemy used childlike tactics. They drove directly towards us. It is madness. But that madness was method. American tank commanders had learned from hard experience in Normandy. Never fight a Panther on its terms. The only way to beat German armor was to get close enough to hit the sides or rear, where the Panther's armor was thinner. In fog, smoke, or urban terrain, the Sherman's inferior gun didn't matter. Speed, radio coordination, and numbers did. And unlike the Germans, who often relied on hand signals or shouted orders, every U.S. tank was radio-linked. They could coordinate ambushes and flanking maneuvers faster than the Germans could react.
Creighton Abrams' Gamble. Colonel Creighton Abrams, whose name would later be given to the modern M1 Abrams tank, understood the Sherman's limitations better than anyone. He knew his tanks couldn't duel Panthers head-on, so he encouraged aggressive, unpredictable tactics. If you're not shooting, move. If you're not moving, reload. If you're not reloading, get out of the way. At Arracourt, Abrams used terrain, weather, and communication to turn weakness into advantage. His Sherman stayed in constant motion, firing while maneuvering through fog and hedgerows. By the end of the first day, his battalion had destroyed 28 German tanks for the loss of only 7 Shermans. The Germans were stunned. They had expected a rout. Instead, they had walked into a textbook example of American tactical adaptation. The counterattack failed. Over the next 10 days, the Battle of Arracourt turned into one of the most lopsided tank engagements of the Western Front. German reinforcements kept attacking, believing they faced a small, disorganized force. But Abrams's battalion used deception, smoke, and ambushes to make 80 Shermans look like 300. Each time the Panzers attacked, the Americans repositioned, using fog and terrain to lure them into open ground, then hitting them from the flanks. By the end of September, the Germans had lost 86 tanks and 49 assault guns. The 4th Armored Division lost only 25 Shermans. It was a stunning reversal of the early war myth. The stupid Sherman had beaten the most advanced tanks of the Wehrmacht. The lesson the Germans never learned. German reports after Arracourt called the American tactics reckless, undisciplined, and chaotic. But in truth, that chaos was controlled. It was the flexibility of a modern army. The Germans fought by rigid doctrine. The Americans adapted on the fly. Their stupid fog charge was born not of madness, but of understanding. The Sherman was no match for a Panther in a gunnery contest, but wars aren't fought on paper. The Germans never fully accepted that the Americans had mastered maneuver warfare. They believed the defeat at Arracourt was due to bad weather, poor reconnaissance, or bad luck. But it was more than that. It was proof that industrial power, fast learning, and decentralized command could beat even the most advanced machines. The aftermath. When the fog lifted on the final day, the fields around Arracourt were littered with burned-out tanks. German soldiers called it Die Panzerschlacht im Nebel, the tank battle in the fog. For the Americans, it was a turning point. They had proven that with the right tactics, the Sherman could do the impossible. And the Germans, who once laughed at stupid American tanks, never laughed again. The legacy. The lessons of Arracourt shaped modern armored warfare. U.S. tank doctrine began to emphasize mobility, coordination, and communication over pure firepower. When the Cold War began, those lessons led to the development of the M60 and later the M1 Abrams, a tank named after the man who turned the tide at Arracourt. The stupid tactic, charging into the fog, closing the distance, became known as aggressive proximity engagement. It's still studied in military academies today as a masterclass in turning weakness into advantage.
The ghosts of Arracourt. The morning after the battle, a heavy silence fell over the hills of Lorraine. Burned tanks smoldered in the dew. The once green fields were now streaked with black oil and broken metal. U.S. soldiers from the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion walked among the wrecks, counting destroyed German tanks. They found them clustered in small groups. Panthers with their turrets blown open. Panzer IVs burned out from within. The soldiers were stunned, by the sheer number. Private First Class Raymond Cole later wrote in his diary, "It looked like a graveyard of monsters. They said we were fools for charging, but those fools were still alive." What the Americans didn't realize yet was that they had just fought one of the largest tank battles ever on the Western Front, and won against superior machines. The German perspective. Inside what remained of the 113th Panzer Brigade, Major Rudolf von Hilsen tried to make sense of the defeat. His reports to headquarters were grim. Enemy tanks moved recklessly. They closed the range in suicidal fashion, often appearing from fog and smoke without warning. Our gunners could not maintain target discipline. To von Hilsen and his officers, it seemed madness. The Shermans had ignored all principles of armored warfare. Instead of using long-range gunnery, they rushed close and fought knife-range duels. But that was the genius of Creighton Abrams and his men. They had rewritten the rulebook. Fog, smoke, and terrain turned every fight into a close-quarters ambush. The Germans' long-range optics and powerful guns were useless at 100 meters, and the Shermans' faster turret rotation, nearly 24 degrees per second compared to the Panthers' slow 6 degrees, made the difference between life and death. A tank named Batlin Basic. One Sherman, serial number 301-07321, became a legend in the 37 Tank Battalion. Its crew, Sergeant Glenn Brugman, Gunner Joe D'Angelo, and driver Harold Tex Whitmore, claimed 5 Panther kills in a single day during the battle. Their method was unorthodox. They used the rolling fog like a curtain. Every time a Panther fired, the flash gave them a bearing. They'd rush forward, pivot left or right, fire, then vanish back into the mist. When Brugman's gunner scored a direct hit on a Panther side, D'Angelo shouted, "Who's stupid now?" That single phrase spread through the battalion like wildfire. By nightfall, it became the unofficial motto of the battle. Who's stupid now? Abrams' command philosophy. Colonel Abrams never sat in a rear command post. He was famous for leading from the front, often in a tank himself. His orders were simple and aggressive. Hit hard, move fast, stay unpredictable. Unlike many German commanders who relied on strict formation discipline, Abrams encouraged initiative. Tank commanders were told to make their own decisions if cut off, a radical concept in 1944. In German doctrine, junior officers waited for orders. In Abrams' battalion, they acted first, reported later. That freedom allowed Shermans to respond instantly to threats, forming impromptu flanking groups, using smoke grenades creatively, and exploiting confusion. It was what military historians later called distributed initiative, decades ahead of its time. Radio warfare. The secret weapon of the Americans at Arracourt wasn't the tank, it was the radio. Every Sherman had a reliable SCR 508 FM radio, allowing platoons to share targeting data instantly. German Panzers, by contrast, often only had one radio per platoon, usually in the commander's tank. That meant when a German tank was destroyed, communication collapsed. American units could coordinate fire traps. One tank would bait the Germans while others circled to attack from the flanks. The fog amplified the confusion. German tankers often fired at phantom targets or their own comrades. Lieutenant James L. Knott described it, "You could hear their turrets turning, the creak of metal, then a flash. You'd count to 3, then you'd fire at where the flash came from. You didn't see them, you felt them."
When the fog lifted, by September 20th, the fog began to thin. For the first time in 2 days, the sun cut through the gray. The Americans braced for a renewed German assault, but it never came. Recon aircraft soon revealed the reason. The 113th and 111th Panzer Brigades were shattered. Of the 86 tanks that had started the offensive, fewer than 40 remained operational. Many had been abandoned when they ran out of fuel or ammunition. German survivors trudged east, shaken. One captured tank officer told his interrogator, "Your tanks have no fear. You drive them like horses, wild, stupid horses. But we could not stop them. Aftermath of the battle. In total, between September 19 and September 29, 1944, the Battle of Arracourt cost Germany nearly 200 armored vehicles and over 1,000 men. The U.S. 4th Armored Division lost fewer than 30 Shermans and 200 men. It was the worst defeat for German armor on the Western Front since D-Day. News of the victory spread quickly through Patton's Third Army. The press called it a fog miracle. But for the men who fought there, it was simply the result of adaptation and guts. Creighton Abrams received the Distinguished Service Cross, and his tank battalion became a symbol of American resilience. The German analysis. After the war, captured German documents revealed the disbelief in their ranks. The German General Staff concluded that the defeat at Arracourt was due to adverse weather conditions reducing visibility, lack of aerial reconnaissance, and inadequate coordination between tank and infantry. What they didn't write was the truth, that they had been outthought. German doctrine assumed the enemy would act predictably. The Americans didn't. They used flexibility, radio control, and speed, elements the rigid German system could not match. Historians later called Arracourt the moment when the U.S. Army became tactically superior to the Wehrmacht. A German's reflection. Years later, in the 1960s, a former German tank commander named Karl-Heinz Schreiber visited the Arracourt battlefield. He stood beside a rusted Sherman Hall, now half sunk into the grass. To a local reporter, he said quietly, "We thought them fools, but they were not fools. They understood something we did not, that war is movement, not perfection." His words captured what many veterans felt. The Sherman, though mocked, had embodied a different kind of strength, adaptability. Lessons that lived on. After the war, American tank doctrine evolved based on the Arracourt experience. Rather than chase the dream of building a supertank, designers focused on mobility, reliability, and crew communication. The M26 Pershing and later the M46, M48, and M60 followed this philosophy. Eventually, it culminated in the M1 Abrams, the ultimate descendant of those fog-fighting Shermans. In West Germany, NATO tank officers in the 1970s studied Arracourt in war colleges, using it as a case study in asymmetric tank warfare. They learned that a weaker tank, used intelligently, could defeat a stronger one. Rediscovery. In 2019, French archaeologists and historians surveyed the Arracourt battlefield. Using drone imagery and ground-penetrating radar, they discovered dozens of buried tank hulls, most German. Among them were several Panthers still bearing battle scars from Sherman shells. One was pierced neatly through the side armor, a classic example of the close-range flank shot used in 1944. Inside, they found remnants of uniforms and a single helmet resting on the turret floor. On the side of the hull, faintly visible under rust, were chalk letters, "Zerekt in 3 Tagen," back in 3 days. They never returned.
The human cost. For all its tactical brilliance, the Battle of Arracourt was brutal. Tank crews burned alive in seconds, and infantry caught between tanks were crushed under treads. Private Harry Denton of the 10th Armored Infantry later wrote, "We won, but the price was high. The fog kept the smell of death close. It never left your nose." Victory came not from superior weapons, but from courage under impossible conditions. Legacy of the stupid tactic. Today, the so-called stupid tactic of closing the range is recognized as a turning point in armored warfare. It demonstrated that battlefield innovation, not technology, often decides wars. The men of Arracourt proved that adaptability beats arrogance.
German commanders laughed when the Shermans charged into the fog. By the end of the day, 12 of their Panzers burned on the fields of Lorraine. And that was just the beginning. Epilogue. They never laughed again. In his post-war memoir, Creighton Abrams was asked what he thought of the Sherman's reputation. He replied simply, "It wasn't the tank. It was the men inside." Those men, the so-called fools who drove into fog and fire, became the heroes who rewrote the rules of armored combat. To this day, historians call the Battle of Arracourt the Sherman's finest hour. And among the wrecks that still rest beneath the soil of Lorraine, the ghosts of that foggy morning whisper the same truth.